What a guy.
What a guy, David Harrison. And of course, although he brings probably no good tidings, given all the havoc that's going on in the nation's capital, I guess, there may be a silver lining in all the clouds that we've been seeing on a national level. Um, I'm Reed Price, as you know, and I'm welcoming you to something to talk about on the this first Friday in October. Well, it's not the first Friday, is it? Yes,
Yeah,
it is. Yes, it is. Because I got to check my calendar, man. Next month, we're not going to meet on the first Friday. But anyway, we are here to talk about politics with David Harrison. And I like to always thank the folks at Fieldstone who help with supporting programs at the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center. Call 360-594-1010 to learn more about their independent living, assisted living, and memory care up on Rolling Bay. Also, we'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the ancestral homeland of the Puget Sound Coast Salish people. We are grateful for the Suquamish tribe's uh, care and responsibility for these waters of the Salish Sea and our surrounding lands since time immemorial. Thank you, David, for joining us once again. Boy, we've got a full plate this month.
Yes, so Reed asked me to talk in addition to the exciting times in the House of Representatives. Reed asked me to talk about two things which will be fresh subjects for us. Excuse me. One of them will be what's happening with the Supreme Court and voting rights case, which is very exciting and surprising things. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Biden-Trump labor issues that happened in Michigan this last week. So that'll give us new material. We'll start with a bizarre set of circumstances in the United States House of Representatives. As some of you will remember, I kind of sort of thought that Hakeem Jeffries and the Democrats would bail out Kevin McCarthy, especially when he did a continuing resolution to keep the government open. And I'll try and explain why that didn't happen. All of what would have taken was not an affirmative vote for McCarthy, but for 16 or so Democrats, 18 to vote present. Then McCarthy, you just have to win the majority of those voting yay or nay, and McCarthy would have survived. I think it's possible that McCarthy expected them to do that too, because there are a fair amount of moderates in the Democratic caucus who certainly appreciated the idea of keeping the government open, since that's their responsibility. Weirdly, he made no public appeal to Democrats, and the reason for that, of course, is because if you make a public appeal for Democratic help, then you can jettison as many Republican votes as you get Democratic votes because you did that. The public reason that Jeffries prevailed upon 210 Democrats to not vote present or vote for McCarthy, they voted for Jeffries, was that McCarthy appeared on Face the Nation on Sunday, right after the Democrats gave him 90 or 100 votes to keep the government open. And Jeffries played that to the caucus when they met. And in it, McCarthy said that Democrats tried to do everything they could do to keep the resolution from passing. And Margaret Brennan even laughed when he said that. And of course, it's a damnable lie. And so that annoyed people who were on the fence. However, it wasn't the only thing that was going on. First, there was still a lot of resentment, even in the moderates in the caucus, about McCarthy, not just his position on issues, but they don't think he's a trustworthy person. That in DC, of course, is not a non-typical feeling about one member about it, the other, but they felt he was uncommonly untrustworthy, and that they had, in particular, some promises, quiet promises, between McCarthy and Biden, and even between McCarthy and Volodymyr Zelensky, that something would happen with Ukraine, and and to this day, I think Biden feels that he had an agreement from McCarthy to put in a continuing resolution some language that would allow Biden to use some of the armaments, some of the weaponry that we have in the stock of the United States Armed Forces. At any rate, they're mad at him. They were mad at him for turning his back on his own budget agreement with Biden, for aiding Jim Jordan and others in this ludicrous impeachment inquiry, which McCarthy knows isn't going anywhere and doesn't believe should go anywhere. Again, they're upset with him on Ukraine. We're upset. And they think he sold his soul at the outset to Matt Gaetz and others. And as I say, they didn't just think he was duplicitous, they thought he was uncommonly duplicitous. So what Face the Nation really meant is that moderates, some of the moderates said in their own districts that they were inclined to at least consider keeping Kevin McCarthy and voting to do so. So they needed a collective reason, if they weren't going to do it, to not do it. Either way, the progressives, Pramila Jayapal, and others would have followed Jeffries if they had to, but they would have been severely annoyed to have to do so. And what happened was Face the Nation gave the caucus a way to unite, and those moderate members could go back to their editorial boards and home constituency and say, you know, they're for good government, but that was the last straw when McCarthy did that on Face the Nation. So that's what I think happened. So why, if that's why it happened, why is it even thinkable to dump somebody who would keep the government open and have a race between full-out election deniers who are to the right of the caucus? It seems weird that 8 people could take a caucus down, and that, of course, would only be possible if all the Democrats voted for the Democrat. So 8 people did take. There's at least 160 Republicans who are really mad at those 8 people, and then another 50 or 60 that are plenty happy that it happened, and that they didn't have to vote to do it. So why would Jeffries take that risk? I think that's the big issue. And let me say, and then I'll stop for a minute and take questions, thoughts, and concerns about what I've said so far. Jeffries thinks there's a major advantage in November 2024 in taking back the House to have these folks continue to fight. So often we have battles in Washington, D.C., and the press says, can't these two sides get together? And when they say that, they're calling for Democrats and Republicans to work it out. And they're mad at both parties for not working it out, and always mad at Republicans for wanting to close down the government. In this case, anybody who's at least aware of what's going on in DC knows that this is a fight between Republicans, and they're not in horror that Jeffries didn't give McCarthy the votes. So why is Jeffries in horror? Because it means whichever one of these folks get it, the probability is somebody's going to be elected who's even less likely to want to keep the government open than McCarthy. In fact, I'm positive of it. So why would Jeffries do that? He undoubtedly thinks that that's to our advantage and to the advantage of Democrats in November of 2024. I say "our" because I am one. Um, he thinks that John Thune, as you know, Mitch is physically in trouble, and the force behind the Republicans in the Senate is John Thune of South Dakota, and John Thune is going to be Mitch's successor and beat out Rick Scott of Florida. And that means that the conservative moderates are winning over the conservatives, and that Rick Scott, Ted Cruz types are not going to be in the majority of those 48 or so Republicans. And Jeffries thinks that Thune will continue to do what the Republicans in the Senate have done so far, which is we want to keep the government open. Jeffries thinks he's got another way to do Ukraine. I certainly don't know what it is. Scalise has voted for some Ukraine aid lately. So maybe if Scalise wins, there's a way to get that on the floor. Biden said the other day, well, I'm not going to say what it is, but there's another way to do this. I don't know what that is unless he has a way by executive order to send some of our existing stockpile. Jeffries feels that he can use discharge positions. As you know, the other day they discharged the budget bill before they passed it, and that's a simple up or down. If you get a petition from more than half of the House, it's a privileged motion on the floor. So Jeffries is bargaining that if we close the government 45 days from now, for 2 weeks or so, there'll be enough Republicans to join the Democrats in a discharge position, and they'll pass some kind of budget. So that's what Jeffries is thinking. So he feels like he's got some protection in having some more to the right wing speaker, and he thinks that'll be an advantage for Biden if he runs. I'm here to tell you that this thing yesterday over the wall is one more piece of evidence that we're going to have a hard time taking advantage of our gains in the House if Joe Biden underperforms in certain ways. And to have his Homeland Security Secretary file a petition to waive all sorts of environmental and other standards, saying that he needed the wall, and then to have Biden say he didn't need the wall, and then to have Mayorkas say it was taken out of context. It was taken in context. So this is not promising. We need to fix that. So anyway, let me stop. I'm going to say who I think is going to win, but let me stop for a minute and let's talk about what happened and what we think about what happened. Sheila, you're muted.
I sure was. So if Jordan gets on there, or even Scalise, but mostly Jordan, and he decides, which he probably would, to not even bring anything to the floor, what happens then?
Well, that's what the discharge position does. So,
oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I guess I don't know what that meant.
That means that if you're a member and you sign a petition that calls for something to be taken to the floor, if more than half the members sign that petition, then it has to be treated as a privileged motion. So that's how you can dislodge something that a committee has locked up. And the reason why it rarely happens is if you're a Republican, the number one way to get killed by Jim Jordan and maybe Donald Trump would be to sign such a petition. But if the government's closed for 2 weeks and the market has dropped 10%, then all bets are off. I mean, they just had a whole bunch of Republicans vote for the continuing resolution. They may not act like it, but there are 150 or so Republican House members that don't like this. So that would be how you could, I mean, Jim Jordan would be for a longer shutdown than a lot of his members would,
Oh,
and
yeah.
their tool is a discharge position. Other questions and
Thank you.
thoughts on these matters? All very interesting. Now, those of you who are not showing us your video picture, we know that you're eating Cheetos on the couch. So let your secret is, I'm disclosing your secret even without seeing you.
So I just have I guess that this is based on what you already said, maybe somewhat obvious, but there's been a few pleas in the editorial pages and opinion writers about the idea of some sort of a moderate Republican. I think Representative Lawler maybe as being a candidate that could run for the speaker and attract Democrats and Republicans. Is that on the other hand, whenever that's said, it said this will never happen, but it should. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I can't remember what year, but one year the Senate was almost tied, or one short or something like that many years ago. And Jim Jeffords, the congressperson from, I'm sorry, the senator from Vermont who replaced Bob Stafford, went over, declared himself a Democrat, and they gave him a committee chairmanship. So we're pretty close. And you would need 5 or 6 Republicans to vote with the Democrats, and they would reward them handsomely. That's not going to happen. So what Reed was saying is they wouldn't join the caucus, but they would elect Jeffrey Speaker. Well, they would get kicked out of the Republican caucus, and they would get primaried, and not very many of them would survive. So it's politically suicidal. You could have it from somebody who wasn't running anyway. But Lawler's a relatively new member, so I think it's why people who aren't in the Freedom Caucus look so ineffectual. You would think, they're really mad. They think their party just got hijacked. They're very mad. What they haven't figured out is what to do with their anger, and almost anything they can think of to do would result in their political demise. So that's so far why it hasn't happened. Other questions before I complete one more part of this particular tale? So I think between Scalise and Jordan, I'd pick Scalise. He got shot in the line of duty playing softball. He's gotten chemo now, so it's a hard time to become speaker. But he has a better relationship with Jeffries than Jordan does. And Jim Jordan is veno. I don't know if Scalise is veno. He might be. He's not as obviously veno as Jim Jordan. Kevin Hearn from Oklahoma is also conservative, also an election denier. There's some thought that he might have a shot. What the Republicans are trying to do, to their credit, is decide on somebody before they do it in public. They're going to try and do it in caucus. That should be interesting. I can't believe they would come out of that caucus united behind Jim Jordan, even though he's presenting himself as dealing with all sides. He's the person behind the lie that is the weaponization of the Justice Department. He knows better. I mean, he's not for Trump chatting about classified information. This is a made-up story. Sheila.
What's going on with Trump going to be Speaker of the House?
Yeah, he's not going to be. He endorsed. He's now endorsed Jim Jordan. And
yeah, he did.
He did say that he was willing to be. Right now, there's a House rule passed by the Republicans that you can't be Speaker if you've been indicted in the last 2 years. So they'd have to change the rule. But it just shows his high regard for his own self. I should mention, as we're talking about all this, that J.D. Vance, the senator from Ohio, Republican senator, that was interviewed the other day and asked what surprised him most about being in the Senate. And he said he was surprised that people don't really hate each other the way he thought they did. So some of this is performative, and certainly all of Matt Gaetz is performative. He's out there tweeting or Xing to raise money while he's taking McCarthy down. So as Reed mentioned, it could be that somehow Jeffries could end up as speaker. I don't think so. So what will happen is, I have no idea. Possibly Scalise can get enough endorsement and supports that Jordan will yield to him and the caucus will elect him. Certainly, Matt Gaetz has already said that he would be fine with Scalise. So I guess if I had to guess, that would be what I would guess. Other questions on this matter in terms of how we will survive as Americans? Remember, this is just one part of the government. And again, the answer to get them to there's a whole bunch of that caucus that doesn't believe in compromise. And as John Thune said, the presidency and the Senate are controlled by Democrats. You can't be a force if you don't compromise. The Jim Jordan difference is he would try enforce a better compromise by keeping the government closed longer. It's just at a certain amount of heat, especially with the markets, that will break down, as it always does. It always does for a reason. You're not paying TSA agents. You're not paying soldiers. It's very annoying to soldiers when they are being soldiers and are not getting paid, especially since that's not a very lucrative profession. So they're sitting there on base trying to pay for childcare or something. They don't have any money, and the pressure starts to mount. So shall we move on to topic number 2? So as Reed noted, there's a huge Supreme Court case in September. Actually, the case was in June, the first ruling, and then the court refused to stay the lower court's subsequent decision in September. So this is all fresh. This is a case in Alabama using Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to overcome Alabama's map for the next election. This is huge, and it has implications for several states. So the question you would ask is, how could this happen given that the Supreme Court just took apart affirmative action? And the answer is there's a different history to voting rights. So after the Civil War, we passed the 13th Amendment that ended slavery. The 14th Amendment gave African American citizenship, and the 15th Amendment gave them the right to African American males the right to vote. And for a long time in the South, immediately after, there were elected officials all over the South who were African Americans. And then Jim Crow laws took over big time. There were laws in states saying if your family wasn't a voter in 1860, you couldn't be a voter. But ultimately, by the time I, as a young activist high school student, went south in 1964, it was all about poll taxes and literacy tests. So they were using both of those to deny the vote to Black Southerners outrageously. And then you would have in a county 10,000 African Americans and 20 voters or something like that. It was outrageous. So Lyndon Johnson got the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965, and it prohibited racial discrimination in voting. And there was a meaningful further modification in 1982, where Republicans in particular were afraid that law could be misinterpreted to say that it was a constitutional obligation in a state that had, say, 30% of one minority to have 3 out of its 10 Congress people be members of that minority. This is about opportunity and not about results. So Republicans and Democrats agreed to that. And ever since 1982, the court has stewarded the principle that minority groups that tend to vote in a more consolidated fashion, meaning much more likely to be African Americans than, say, Asian Americans, that they be given fair opportunity for their candidates. So in comes Alabama, who has done their redistricting map by computer, giving them a chance to say that there was no obvious racial discrimination in their efforts. But that's not what the law says. Voting Rights Act, as interpreted by the courts, is looking at effect as well as obvious intent. And in the case of Alabama, they had split up what's called a black belt, concentration of black voters among districts, and diluted, many think intentionally, the impact of those voters, and they had kept the Gulf Coast all in one district. So they had the oral arguments in the spring, and it sure thought, you listen to Cokie Roberts, people like that, everybody thought it was a replay of affirmative action in their oral arguments, except something happened between then and the writing of the opinion. And what happened was Brett Kavanaugh, who voted with the 3 liberals and Roberts to overturn what Alabama had done, and to basically the appellate court had 2 Trump appointees on it, and they had overturned Alabama's decision. So what the Supreme Court did was refuse to turn around 40 years of case law, and they refused to do with voting rights what they did with affirmative action, mainly because it has a different history. 40 years of refinement on what represents an impermissible behavior, having to do with giving voters a fair opportunity to express themselves politically, and whether that's been denied because of race. So the test they started in 82 had to do with, well, is this population likely to vote for the most part with each other, and are they sufficiently geographically compact to make that redistricting possible? And so basically what Kavanaugh did is vote with Roberts and uphold the application of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to Alabama, which means they also rejected the doctrine that they could keep on doing this until they run out of arguments. They refused Alabama's appeal, and that means Alabama's got to do this by the 2024 election. And it probably means Louisiana will have to do it, and it probably means Georgia will have to do it. And there's other pending cases, but those are the ripest. So this is fairly monumental. And again, the whole origin of it is race discrimination, and voting occupies an all different statutory and constitutional place than does things like affirmative action. So Roberts noted that there were 11 maps submitted by the plaintiffs that would have been constitutional, and Kavanaugh rejected. The state said that there's an historical argument for keeping the Gulf Coast intact. And he said the Gulf Coast doesn't have any more standing than the Black Belt in terms of cohesiveness. And they all rejected the idea that history would be passed, that staying as close as possible to previous maps would be an imperative, because of course, if your previous map had racist intent, you would just be trying to duplicate it. To make a long story short, then there are other pending ripe cases. This is not going to change. Kavanaugh is not going to change his mind. And with these particular 9 justices voting 5-4, Southern states are going to continue to be held responsible for how they distribute the population among congressional districts. And certainly by next year, that will be true of Louisiana and Georgia, as well as Alabama. It's very interesting. It's kind of heartening. As the Brennan Center, NYU, which is the best in the world on this kind of stuff, says, it's still a thin Voting Rights Act. As you know, the court last year stopped the pre-approval procedure, but it's still pretty remarkable, and I'm here to report it to you. I also want to note that it's not the only thing that's happened in terms of redistricting. Here's the rundown. I reminded you before that Democrats are guilty, as well as Republicans, in reducing the number of swing seats. What they do is cut deals. Here in Washington State, the reason why Susan DelBene and originally Denny Heck won their seats is that there was a deal cut to basically protect Reichert's ability to win in Bellevue. And that was supposed to be the Republicans' seat in the mix. And of course, it didn't work out that way. Reichert retired, Kim Schreier won and still holds that seat. So right now, we're befuddling the expectations of the panel, which was 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and then they get together and name the 5th person, and they cut deals. And they've been doing that so long that they've reduced the number of swing districts in Washington. Jay Inslee once won in the Wenatchee district. Of course, famously, Tom Foley served Spokane. But we don't have that so much, and the Democrats are as much at fault as the Republicans. So here's the rundown. In 19 states, Republicans control both parts of the legislature, and they draw the map. In 7 states, Democrats do. In 5 states, there's political commissions like the one we have that involve horse trading, not always to the benefit of citizens who like swing districts. 8 states, courts have intervened so much that they're drawing the map. 4 states that have independent commissions, which is a good thing, like Michigan just voted. 6 states that are at large and only have 1 congressman, so it's easy. And so right now we have maybe 40% of the country having some interest in the citizens and not just the parties, and the other 60% having no such expressed interest. And there'll be some more ballot initiatives on this. If you have a hankering to change Washington, don't bother, because there's no way the Democratic Party would allow that to happen. They're not going to be for an independent commission. You'd be better off thinking about ranked choice voting, which is another way to push toward choices by voters than you would by trying to overturn our political commission. So that's my report on racism and the Alabama case. Do we have questions or thoughts? Thank you, Reed, for suggesting it. I had to study this because I had followed the case, but I didn't realize how committed Roberts and Kavanaugh are to basically a 3-part test, all of which has to do with compactness and the tendency of people to vote with each other, that they set as a 1982 standard, and they're still, the whole case was we still believe in the standard. 5 of them do. So that if there was another Supreme Court justice named, you'd want to know what they felt about that. So that's my report. Questions on that case or those cases? As you know, that's not the only issue in redistricting. That's why I made it a point to mention the breakdown of the other states. If a state Supreme Court intervenes, sometimes that has to do with the language of the state constitution. In North Carolina, famously, the legislature, that was a redistricting case too, and the court intervened. And thanks, Ed and Jackie, good to see you. It says Jake, is that your real name?
That's the name. Yeah. Jake and Ed, thanks for coming. And thanks for participating. And David,
try not
you.
to say anything wise in the next 10 minutes, so you won't miss.
Watch out. Well, it will all be on tape, so there you go.
Yeah. So,
I think one of the things I found interesting was the remedies of independent commissions and ranked choice voting as sort of the direction that we might go to try to support democracy in this time of horse trading and control.
Well, let's take up ranked choice voting again next time. But basically, the arguments that they're making is that if somebody is hoping to get advanced with second place votes as well as first place votes, that it's going to make them more interested in hearing the views of a wider percentage of the voters. And so that it might give some pressure toward moderation. Careful what you wish for, because sometimes you could get moderation that you weren't necessarily hoping was going to happen, but that's a different story. What I was saying about North Carolina is that was a redistricting case too. And in that case, North Carolina state legislature argued independent legislature theory that, and basically said that the Constitution did not give their Supreme Court the ability to review election rules, and the Supreme Court said that they were wrong, 6-3. Amy Coney Barrett voting with Kavanaugh and leaving Alito and Thomas and Gorsuch by themselves. So one other quick topic, also suggested by Reed, and that is what happened with Labor and Biden and Trump in Michigan, which is my home state. My son just got off strike. He's a screenwriter, so that is not the most beleaguered of all professions. They do extremely well, but they were terrified of AI because it steals their work. And in his own case, he was a writer for Orange is the New Black. The way that things are set up decreases royalties for the 3 episodes that he wrote. So it had very real financial impact on our family, or at least on him. So things have changed over the years with unions, and it's good for us to remember as Biden and Trump visit Michigan what has changed. Back when I was in Michigan, Tom was in Ohio, in 1980, 23% of the labor force was unionized, and right now it's 10%. This did not come from people throwing out their unions, not at all. That would be minor. It happened by the economy growing in sectors that don't tend to have unions. There's been very little successful organizing in the tech sector, and that's where we've got monumental growth with almost no unions. So in the olden days, it wasn't just United Auto Workers, it was the steel workers and any number of skilled trade unions that were dominant in the AFL-CIO. And now, at least in the union movement, SEIU, which is service employees, are very powerful. And of course, the teachers are represented by various teachers unions and governmental employees, most often represented by AFSCME. So it's changed the setting, and these unions have different things that they prioritize. There's still an argument over what happened, but it's pretty clear that Ronald Reagan was successful monumentally against Mondale because he won a lot of the union vote, that we recovered a lot of those votes, nearly all maybe, with Bill Clinton. Obama did very well with unions in 1912, and there's an argument over how much, but there was a demonstrable downturn with Hillary in 2016, which I think certainly provably cost us Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and the election, cost Democrats the election, and provable return back in maybe not all the way to Biden from Obama's 2012 numbers, but the labor vote for Biden was way higher than the labor vote for Hillary Clinton. So remember these distinctions, the difference between organized labor specifically and laborers, or what is referred to as working men and women in general. That is, organized labor is significantly more likely, even with Trump's inroads, to vote for the Democrat than the working man is in general. And that is because members of organized labor who are working are more aware of the economic issues that are part of their contract. So that's a big difference, and it's provable in terms of the data. There's a difference between being on the job or not. It's provable that a lot of retirees move away from the political position of organized labor for once they become retired. There's a difference between our candidates. So obviously, it wasn't, if Joe Biden had been the presidential candidate in 2016, which he was not, he would have gotten more labor votes than Hillary Clinton, just because Joe Biden has a 40-year record with organized labor. There's a difference between unions, as I mentioned, teachers, SEIU, healthcare workers, some of which are SEIU and a lot not. The union worker is always more likely to vote for the Democrat than the same demographic non-union person. As you know, the whole thing is economics versus culture wars, except I would remind you that there's a lot of people in union pushing states that do not like United States immigration policy, such as it is. And they don't like inflation. And even though it's pretty much broken, it's still in the minds of people. And it takes $5 sometimes for a gallon of gas. So I would say Democrats should not take this vote for granted. Trump appeared at a non-union work site and got a little bit of press, but I don't think it's significant for Michigan. I think if Democrats run, we keep on saying if Democrats run a good candidate for president in November, they can hold on to Michigan. The whole blue wall still has a basis. Gretchen Whitmer won by 600,000 votes, so Biden by 200,000-300,000. So I'm not thinking that's. I think it's all in what party nominates who. If I was, say, a Democratic leader, I'd be shopping around. I think dear old Joe, with a magnificent set of legislative accomplishments, is fading. I think we need to be the ones that are sure to run the next generation, or even skip a generation, run somebody in their 50s or early 60s. So there's a congressman from Minnesota, I just forgot his name, Dean Phillips, is that it? Who's talking about running. Next blog, I'm gonna suggest that people write him and support him, not because he'll be the nominee, but that Democrats need a signal that they're certainly not getting from Bobby Kennedy Jr., that we need to do something, and we should do it fast. On the Republican side, there's a new poll that shows that Nikki Haley might be improving in New Hampshire. If she can create a narrative where she's within 20 points of Trump and she's ahead of DeSantis, there might be candidates that go with her, and she might be able to consolidate some votes. The other thing that's happening is very rich Republicans who don't want Trump are meeting in early November or late October to talk one more time about Glenn Youngkin. But right now, Trump's the man. We'll see how long he'll be the man as trials continue. So that's my thoughts on that. Questions, thoughts, concerns on this matter? Questions on anything?
Maria.
I just want to say, Dean Phillips is Ann Lander's grandson, I believe.
Huh.
And, you know, then that would make him related to her sister. But I think his money, there is some kind of a company he had, but his money, or at least one of his companies, is Talente Gelato. So that's perfect company to have your fortune be coming from. You know, there's some oil, but it's like coconut oil or something. So I thought he was really impressive, the things that I saw, the clips of him.
He would have to give up his House seat, of course, to actually run. But Talente might get my sweetie's vote. She loves that stuff. That's good. That's a great gelato. I think we need a signal, and it could be that what we mentioned before. It could be that Joe doesn't intend to run, or it could be that our mothers and fathers of our party are talking to Joe. Who knows? I'm just saying this is gonna bite Democrats on the posterior. Doesn't mean that Biden couldn't beat Trump. Do you really want that matchup of a 80-year-old man and an 82-year-old man, one of who's been indicted, the other who's getting physically weaker every day? That says nothing for America. We shouldn't do it. Other thoughts? I think we're done.
Yeah, I did. There was one of the insults that McCarthy apparently spewed on his way out of his speaker seat was that he found Biden to be with it and very sharp and helpful in their conversations, but when talking to the media after that, he basically painted him as a doddering old fool, and that didn't go over well.
That's
so yeah, there were lots of reasons for the Democrats not to bail out McCarthy.
Yeah, that's right, and so perhaps reason too. But I think the fact that Jeffries somehow thinks we got Ukraine covered, I think, is a big issue. I think that would have given them pause. If they thought there was zero chance we'd get money for Zelensky, I don't think they would have done it.
Next, we meet on the 10th of November, the second Friday in November.
Because David's going to Panama to see birds. So we'll see you on the 10th. Good to see you all.